Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of DEI After 5. Now, this is a conversation I'm so excited to have. And I don't always bring guests back, but sometimes I'm like, oh, we're going to have to bring this guest back. And so, based on what's happening right now, everything that's going on, the timing of this was just perfect. And so, my guest this week is Dr. Janice Gassam Asare, who is an organizational psychologist who has been on the show before, but she has a new book that is out, and we are going to dive into it today, and I am thrilled. Dr. Janice, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me back on this show, Sacha. It has been, I don't even remember the last time I was on the show, but I remember things were so different.
I think that was like season 1, season 2, somewhere like way in the beginning when we were still trying to figure all of this out. We were mid-COVID. It was all the things.
Right. And look where we are and how things are now.
Oh my gosh. So I want to dive into why I'm so excited. Yay! Rise and resist. Okay, so it's so funny because I've been having conversations with folks that have kind of been in this space and just thinking back to just different times in my career where I've always been the one to push the envelope, to ask the questions, right? I've shared in past podcast episodes, like I was part of this internal group that we called ourselves the Burn It Down crew, because sometimes you really just have to burn something down, tear it apart in order to rebuild. And I feel like that is where we are right now when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, there's two areas that I want to go with, two paths that I want to go down with you on this, but I want to talk about the book. So this is Rise and Resist, How to Reclaim Workplace Equity and Justice. What made you put this together?
Yeah, so I feel like so many of us last year in 2025 were kind of holding our breath because we knew what was coming with a second Trump term. And at the end of 2024, when I saw the results of the election, I started thinking about and strategizing how, as somebody who does equity work, I was going to navigate this new era that we were being ushered into. And at the end of 2024 and the beginning of 2025, I said I wanted to put out a resource for other practitioners and just anyone that's trying to push change in the workplace so that we can navigate the resistance, because all of us have been noticing that the resistance has been building. Even before the murder of George Floyd, there was always that sort of resistance and pushback to equity work. And then there was like a peak where everyone was really interested in the work. And then in the last few years, that interest has sort of started to wane. Yeah. And so I put out this resource actually January 20th. It was inauguration day in 2025. And I got a lot of really good feedback. And actually, an editor that I had worked with on a previous book reached out to me. He subscribes to my emails and he's like, this is an amazing resource. We have to turn this into a book. And when I started thinking about like what would be the most impactful book, instead of trying to reinvent the wheel and come up with new frameworks and new sorts of theories and models, I felt like now is a really important time for us to be students of history and look at the work of and the strategies and the tools that people who've come before us have utilized. Because as bad as we feel like it is right now, there are so many people that live through worse circumstances and they didn't have all the tools that we have. And so I really was interested in understanding how have specifically Black people resisted throughout time, and what lessons and strategies can we take from their journeys and apply that to what we're going through right now. So that was really like the catalyst behind me writing this book.
I love it. And it's interesting because I was sharing with my producer, Oren, a couple of weeks ago that I've started looking back at, some of just YouTube history. And, we've had this show on now. This is season 12. And so it's okay, like what's going on? What are people looking at? And season 1, episode 2, the history of diversity, equity, and inclusion has been in the top 5 for like the last year. And it's exactly that. It's like, how did we get here? And so people are really trying to figure out, okay, where did this come from? But I love what you're doing, because it's not just, okay, where is this coming from? What is the history of this work? But in those times of resistance, how do we continue to move forward? And what I remember so clearly about that episode, and it was with my cousin who had been doing this work for 40 plus years. She said, I have a lot of battle scars and I've had a lot of fights, and she continued to do the work. And so it just kind of told me, or just kind of, even as I was getting more into the consulting side of this, that there has to be some level of resilience when you do this work. And you can't just, oh, it's getting hard. Let me back away. Let me leave and do something that's easier. Like, no, the work is part of the resilience is the work. And part of the work is resilience. And so, just looking at the book and just some of the people in history that you've pulled from, I'm just blown away, because we know these stories. Many of us know these stories, but not in this context. And so talk to me about how you were able to decide or determine which stories you wanted to highlight and tie to kind of what we're seeing right now.
It was really hard, because I told a friend of mine what I was doing, and when you tell people, they're like, oh my gosh, you have to highlight, this friend of mine is a huge Malcolm X stan, right? She loves Malcolm X. She studied Malcolm X, and she's like, you have to include Malcolm X in the book. And then so I had a running list of maybe 50 figures that I wanted to include. And the editor came back and was like, you can't include 50 people in the book. And so I had to really think about, because I was listening to other people, and I'm like, they're like, maybe you should include this person and that. And I just had too many people. And I'm like, this is a book that I've decided to write. So I have to figure out which people throughout history have resonated with me the most. And also, even though there are some figures that people are familiar with in the book, I tried not to highlight, as much as we all love MLK and Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks, I tried to tell the more untold stories of Black figures that outside of the Black community, people may not know as well. And even within the Black community, right? I focused on a lot of people throughout the civil rights movement who played a more behind the scenes role, but also just global Black resistance. There were stories that I had heard about that maybe people who grew up in the US were not familiar with, right? And so I think that looking into the global Black resistance and the legacy of Black resistance globally is really powerful, because, there are so many stories of it. And so I think that's what I was like, who resonates with me the most? And who are people that a lot of folks, even Black people, may not be familiar with. And so that's kind of how I was guided by which people to include in the book, because there were so many people who were like, include this person in that. And I'm like, well, I don't really know this person's story, or it's powerful, but it doesn't resonate as much with me. So I just focused on the people that I had heard about, that I knew about, and whose stories I think embodied different categories of resistance, I guess you could say, or different types of resistance. And so that's really what I went with, where I feel like there were a lot of people that I knew their stories, but I didn't know as deeply as I did when I was researching the book. And so that's kind of like how there are 32 different Black people that I included in the book. And, again, there are some people you may have learned about, right? I think Ida B. Wells is somebody that people may be familiar with, or Ella Baker,
right?
Or Nina Simone,
yep.
Toni Morrison, right? But then there are maybe people who are less well known, like Mary Ellen Pleasant, or Georgia
Yeah,
Gilmore.
Patrice Lumumba,
Yeah, exactly. Patrice Lumumba. And so there are a lot of people that are less, familiar, that people are less familiar with. And I think that for me, I really wanted people to read these stories. I wanted Black people to read these stories and feel so inspired. But I also wanted people who don't identify as Black to recognize that even if you are not a Black person, there are still tools and strategies that Black people have used to resist that you can also use and you can embody. And so the editor, when I wrote the book, was like, I need to understand, who are you writing this book for? And I was like, well, for Black people. And he's like, but I'm not Black and I'm reading these stories and I'm so inspired. And I was like, oh, well, I mean, I want anyone who wants to create change and feels like they're up against a lot of opposition. I want all of those people to feel like they can read this book and learn about these legacies and feel inspired about what to do next and how to use these strategies to resist right now.
My wheels are just turning 1,000,000 miles an hour right now because my brain is just like, oh my gosh. What I appreciate about that is these are, as you said, stories of resistance, different aspects of resistance. And why I think it resonates right now, especially, is we're at a time where this administration is trying to erase a lot of our history, right? And so you erase what puts a spotlight on injustice and causes some discomfort. The other reason why a lot of these stories are never told is, oh, we don't want to give anybody any ideas, right? Very few people know about the Haitian Revolution. And so to see that in here, to know and understand, even like Nat Turner. I grew up in Virginia. I only knew about Nat Turner because I happened to grow up next to an HBCU where one of the top historians went to my church, right? And so he would tell those stories, or he would make sure as kids we knew some of these names. I didn't learn it in the Chesterfield County school system, right?
Yeah.
So part of that, and part of what we were told as well, too, taught as well, was if you don't know these stories, it does not give you an idea of what you can do or how you can create. So this book speaks in direct opposition of that, right? Here are the stories. Here's what resistance looks like in many different ways. And the other thing that I really love about the book are the micro resistance strategies at the end of the chapters. It doesn't have to be massive. Resistance can happen in small ways. So if and you have this focused on the workplace. I'm trying to figure out the best way to say this. Where resistance does not necessarily bode well in corporate America.
Yeah.
So how should somebody use this book at work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I was on a podcast yesterday, and the person, the host, just asked flat out, how can you resist when corporate structures are, he didn't say these exact words, but what he meant was corporate structures are antithetical to resistance. It's very difficult inside these capitalist corporate structures to embody. And I thought that was a great question. And one of the things that I mentioned to him that I think is also important to say now is that in an ideal scenario, we would not have any of these institutions that exist. I'm somebody that I do believe in abolition, and I believe that we should completely get rid of all these institutions that are causing harm in a number of different ways. But I recognize that the practicality of that, is something that will take time, right? And it's not practical to say tomorrow we will wake up and all of these institutions will be gone. So for the people that are in these institutions, especially now when there's a lot of opposition, what can resistance look like? And I actually think one of the most important chapters in this book for this moment that we're in, I feel like, is chapter 7, where I talk about resistance behind the scenes. Because for anybody who doesn't want to alert the authorities, and by the authorities, I mean the management within a corporation, that you are engaging in activities to resist, there are many ways that you can resist in more covert and more like behind the scenes ways that won't draw a lot of attention to you, right? So some of these methods are more outward facing, but I think right now in this moment, all of us need to read chapter 7 of the book, which is about behind the scenes resistance and ways that we can resist without attracting attention. And so I think that for any employee reading this book, or anybody in a corporate structure reading this book who says, I want to resist, but I don't want to experience opposition or be targeted for my resistance, I would definitely say looking at and rereading chapter 7, which talks about ways that people have resisted behind the scenes, right? A good example is Queen Nanny, who was a Maroon. So the Maroons were a group of enslaved people that escaped, and they built their own like sovereign communities, right, within Jamaica and in different places. And so Queen Nanny was like the leader of a Maroon group in Jamaica in the mountains. And they were able to escape being detected by the British troops that were there at the time, because they learned the terrain and they learned, you know, what important strategies and tactics so that they could be there, but without being detected. And so we could take that lesson and apply it into our workplace. And what does that look like? Well, maybe it's somebody who's in for example, an administrative assistant role. Someone might see that role and say it's not a very powerful position within an organization. But if you're an administrative assistant, you know all the things. You know,
they know where the bones are buried.
Exactly. You know the schedules of all of the important people in the workplace. You know the inner workings and dynamics, and you know a lot of things. And there's ways that you can push things forward in that position, but people wouldn't know, and it's in a more behind the scenes way because of the position, right? And people wouldn't expect someone in that position to be engaging in activities to resist, right? But I think that there are things that we can all do in the workplace and outside of the workplace that are more behind the scenes and don't draw as much attention, but that are still resistance, right? I talked about Georgia Gilmore, who is a really powerful figure, and she was a cook who used her culinary skills to bake goods during the Montgomery bus boycotts. And she gathered a bunch of women together, and they were part of this group, and they would bake goods, and they would go to barbershops and salons and sell these baked goods and use that money to pour it back into those who were engaging in the bus boycotts, right? So people who maybe needed money for taking a different bus service, right? And they poured that money back. And, you know, I didn't know you went to school in Chesterfield County, but I mentioned Maggie Walker, who, if anyone, you know, went to school in Richmond or has been to Richmond, she's a huge pivotal figure in Richmond, Virginia, and how she used her wealth there were so many ways that she used her wealth to build Black folks up and to encourage Black people to own their own bank accounts and put their money in non-white institutions or institutions that were not controlled by their employers. And so there are many ways that we can all resist. But I think that especially right now, how we resist and resisting in ways that are behind the scenes is so paramount, because you don't want to draw attention, especially right now when everyone is being targeted. You don't want to, you know, endanger yourself or endanger your family, but there are ways to resist in more clandestine ways that won't get you detected. And so that's really what I think folks who are worried about their positionality or what resistance could do to them in the workplace, that's what I think they should be focused on, is more behind the scenes resistance.
I love it. I mean, Jackson Ward, Maggie Walker, like that whole, but I think to your point, because she was empowering so many Black communities, right? The power structure that which was like, no, this isn't gonna happen. And Jackson Ward basically went away, right? It's coming back to some degree. But I say that to say it's important to understand this does not have to be marginalized bodies to do this work. And I think that's part of the covertness of it. And what immediately came to mind was the reporter that went undercover and applied for ICE.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she was just like, wait a minute, I just wanted to apply.
Yeah. That is a perfect example of resistance behind the scenes, and then exposing how backwards and silly their system, no background check, no nothing. Like, that's such a perfect example.